an 8-hour problem, so I'd rather take the.
We'll be starting in 1 minute. Cue to the video. I will call this meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission to order. It is Thursday, March 14th, 2024. Our agenda today is to hear the presentation from worker misclassification. We have with us today from the Office of Legislative Auditor, Jody Munson Rodriguez, the Deputy Legislative Auditor, and Caitlin Badger, the Project Manager. We will also hear after that from the agencies. And just a reminder, when we hear reports, we're not taking testimony. It is a presentation where the members will ask the questions. But committees can hear the reports and take testimony at that time. So with that, Legislative Auditor Munson Rodriguez, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Thank you for having us here. For the record, my name is Jody Munson Rodriguez. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor with OLA's Program Evaluation Division. And I want to thank you for having us here today to talk about our newest report that we've released, Worker Misclassification. When workers are incorrectly classified as independent contractors instead of employees, they can miss out on important benefits such as overtime pay or workers' compensation if they are injured on the job. Law-abiding employers can be put at a competitive disadvantage, and state programs can lose out on revenue. Similar to what we reported in 2007, the last time we looked at worker misclassification, our report found that Minnesota's approach to misclassification is both uncoordinated and inadequate. We found that agencies share little information about their investigations or other activities related to misclassification. Employers face limited consequences for misclassifying workers, and misclassification has occurred across a number of industries in Minnesota. We make a number of recommendations to the legislature related to these findings, and to give you some more information about those findings and recommendations, I'm going to move over to the evaluation manager, Caitlin Badger.
Welcome, Manager Badger. Just a couple of quick notes. Representative Anderson and Senator Zhang are participating online. So just to note that they are here online. Welcome.
Thank you.
For the record.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Hansen, members, I want to thank you for having us here today. For the record, my name is Caitlin Badger. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I was the manager for this evaluation. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues on this project, Stephanie Best, Heather Grab, and Luke Wood, and Ms. Best and Ms. Grab are here with us today as well. I'd also like to thank staff from the Department of Labor and Industry, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and the Department of Revenue for their assistance throughout our evaluation. I'll start off by highlighting a few of our key findings. First, the overall rate of misclassification in Minnesota is unknown. Second, even though a statewide misclassification rate is unknown, we did analyze data on a segment of employers in Minnesota that DEED audited as part of the unemployment insurance program, and we found higher rates of misclassification across several metrics this time around than when OLA last evaluated this topic in 2007. We also found that the state's approach to addressing misclassification is inadequate and uncoordinated. For instance, state law outlines limited duties for agencies to address misclassification specifically. And I'll go through here in a moment a number of other things we found in this area. Before I jump into our findings, I want to provide a little overview of worker classification. And before I do this, I want to quickly clarify a little terminology you'll hear me use throughout this presentation. You'll hear me refer to employers a number of times, and to keep things simple, when I refer to an employer, I just mean any entity that pays a worker for their services. So with that being said, a worker's classification is a designation that exists or that indicates a work situation or type of employment relationship that exists between the worker and their employer. Common worker classifications, and the two that we focus on here today, include being an employee and being an independent contractor. Whether a worker is classified as an employee or an independent contractor depends on the circumstances of their work. And state law outlines several sets of factors or tests that must be used to determine a worker's classification. As you can see on the exhibit in our report on pages 24 and 25, those classification tests vary by government program. For example, there's one classification test for the unemployment insurance program and a different test for the workers' compensation program. There are also some classification tests in law for certain industries, such as the construction industry. Generally, however, the more control an employer has over the worker, the more likely that worker is to be an employee. And the more control that the worker has over their own work, the more likely that worker is to be an independent contractor. I'll note that a worker's classification is not determined based on the types of services that a worker provides, and it's also not determined based on the preferences of either the employer or the worker. So what is worker misclassification? Generally, worker misclassification occurs when an employer classifies a worker in a manner that inaccurately represents that relationship between the employer or the worker and the employer. For the purposes of our conversation here today, in our report, we define worker misclassification as occurring when an employer classifies a worker as an independent contractor when that worker is an employee. State law prohibits employers from knowingly misrepresenting their employment relationship with workers, or in other words, employers may not misclassify their workers.
Mr. Chairman,
That arrest.
would you prefer questions at the end of the presentation?
I would prefer at the end because we've got the
Sure.
3 agencies and we want to make sure we
Okay.
fit them in. So
So I'm raising my hand now.
you're, I've got you first on the list. And then we've got Representative Quam. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A worker's classification affects the worker's legal rights and protections, as well as the employer's legal obligations. Employees generally have labor rights and protections that law does not grant to independent contractors. Similarly, state law obligates employers to fulfill certain duties for its employees and not for independent contractors. So when workers are misclassified, it affects both workers and employers. For example, employees are typically eligible for workers' compensation if they are injured on the job. Independent contractors typically are not. If a worker is misclassified, they may not then receive workers' compensation when they're injured. Likewise, employers are required to carry workers' compensation coverage for their employees, but not generally for independent contractors. So that means the employers that misclassify their workers save money by not carrying coverage for the employees as required by law. But meanwhile, law-abiding employers who classify their workers correctly are put at a competitive disadvantage because they have higher labor costs because they're following the law. Misclassification also affects the government and society at large. For example, if an employer did not carry workers' compensation coverage for an employee that they misclassified, the state may pay for the costs of that employee's care if they're injured. If the employer is unable to repay the state for those costs, that leaves the state responsible for the cost of those benefits and reduces the program's overall funding. We provide a short list of other worker rights and employer obligations that are affected by worker classification on page 4 of our report. Before we move on to our findings, I want to briefly touch on the 3 agencies that we focused on for this evaluation. A variety of entities, including employers, state and federal agencies, and the courts, play a role in determining worker classification. In Minnesota, there are several agencies that undertake activities that involve identifying and correcting worker misclassification, but we focused on 3 agencies: the Department of Labor and Industry, or DOLI, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, and the Department of Revenue, DOR. These agencies generally address misclassification as it pertains to their enforcement of various employment-related laws, which you can see here on this slide. State agencies, for example, may need to determine a worker's classification in order to assess whether the worker is entitled to certain rights or eligible for certain labor-related benefits. For instance, independent contractors are generally not eligible for unemployment insurance, so DEED may determine a worker's classification in order to determine whether or not that worker is eligible for that program. So now diving into our findings. One question that we heard frequently was how prevalent is worker misclassification in Minnesota? And we found that the overall rate of misclassification in the state is unknown. None of the agencies that do work related to addressing misclassification in the state currently calculate misclassification rates. Further, as we discuss in our report, there are a number of challenges to calculating a true misclassification rate for Minnesota. For example, the state generally lacks information about independent contractors and lacks information about workers and employers who are operating strictly in the cash-based economy. Even though the overall rate of misclassification is unknown, we thought it would still be informative to provide some updated data on misclassification, even if those data have some important limitations. So we estimated several misclassification rates based on data collected by DEED when they audit employers that contribute to the unemployment insurance program. Before I discuss what we found, I do want to lay out a couple of important limitations to this analysis. So first off, given a number of different factors, which we discuss more in the report, the rates which we present here should not be generalized across the entire population of employers in the state. These numbers just reflect the rate at which DEED auditors found misclassification through their audits of the unemployment insurance program. Also, I'll note, given some changes to DEED's auditing practices, the most recent audit data that we could use for this analysis was from 2018. Nevertheless, our office conducted a similar analysis in 2007 when we last evaluated this topic, and we thought it would be helpful to provide some updated data. So with that being said, we found that 22% of employers that DEED audited misclassified at least one worker in 2018. However, a relatively small share of those employers' total employees were misclassified. So to put numbers to that, of the roughly 25,300 total employees included in DEED's audits for that year, employers misclassified about 4%, or 990 employees. In comparing the misclassification rates we found in our 2007 report, we found that worker misclassification rates were higher across several metrics in 2018 than when we last evaluated this topic in 2007. For instance, according to the 2007 report, about 17% of employers misclassified at least one worker. In contrast, in 2018, we found 22% of employers misclassified at least one worker, or 5 percentage points higher than in our 2007 report. We think there are a number of benefits to tracking worker misclassification rates and trends. For example, state agencies could use these rates to determine the effectiveness of their activities or to determine whether or not there are certain industries that would benefit from additional education about how to properly classify workers. We recommend that the legislature direct a state agency or state agencies to calculate worker misclassification rates in Minnesota on an ongoing basis. And we provide a number of options in our report about different approaches for doing so. I want to transition us now to discuss the state's approach to addressing misclassification. Overall, we determined that Minnesota has neither an adequate nor a coordinated approach for ensuring that workers are properly classified. I'm going to touch next on several reasons why we came to that conclusion. First off, as we outline on page 27 of our report, state law assigns limited duties to DOLI, DEED, and DOR with regard to ensuring that workers are correctly classified. For example, statutes do not direct state agencies to investigate misclassification in and of itself. The law does not direct agencies to provide public outreach or education about misclassification, and it doesn't direct state agencies to calculate misclassification rates. We also found that agency efforts to address misclassification are generally fairly modest, and for the most part, those efforts to identify and correct misclassification result from administering or enforcing other state laws or programs. In other words, state agencies are not generally trying to directly identify or correct misclassification in and of itself. We recommend that if the legislature wants state agencies to play a larger, more direct role in addressing worker misclassification in the state, the legislature should establish in law specific responsibilities for agencies to do so. For example, the legislature could direct agencies to investigate misclassification or to provide education over the topic. We also found that the state's approach to addressing misclassification lacks adequate coordination. First, the authority in law to address misclassification is fragmented across several state agencies. For example, statutes grant DOLI, not DEED or DOR, authority to enforce employment laws regarding minimum wage and overtime pay. So as a result, even though DEED or DOR may find misclassification that could involve violations of minimum wage or overtime requirements, these two agencies do not have the authority to address those violations. DEED and DOR would only have the authority to address violations in the unemployment insurance program and involving state taxes, respectively. So this separation of authority might not present a problem if agencies coordinated their efforts to address misclassification. However, even though DOLI, DEED, and DOR each undertake investigations or audits that analyze whether or not workers were misclassified, they really do that work within their agency silos. So for example, even though their investigations involve doing many of the same activities, the agencies do not collaborate on conducting their investigations. I'll note that though some agency staff commented that collaborating on their investigations can be a little bit tricky because of all of those different tests that I mentioned earlier. Additionally, state agencies do not generally share misclassification complaints that they receive with each other or share their findings of misclassification with each other. Minnesota's lack of interagency coordination is also an issue that we raised in our 2007 evaluation. And we think this lack of coordination is inefficient and ineffective. It also results in inconsistent enforcement activities against employers that misclassify workers, as well as inconsistent remedies for workers. And I'll discuss both of those issues here in a moment. Like Minnesota, authority to address misclassification is fragmented in many different states. However, several states have undertaken some efforts to facilitate a more coordinated statewide approach to addressing worker misclassification. We recommend that the legislature require state agencies to take a more coordinated and collaborative approach to addressing this topic. And at minimum, we'd like to see the legislature direct key agencies, including DOLI, DEED, and DOR, to share information about complaints, investigations, and findings of worker misclassification. I'll note we provide several additional examples in our report of other states' approaches that they've taken to facilitate this more coordinated approach to addressing the topic. In addition to a lack of agency coordination, we also found that some state agencies take many months, even years, to address instances of worker misclassification. Staff at multiple agencies told us that the complicated nature of these investigations mean that some investigations take a year or more. As an example of this, when we reviewed case files of investigations that DOLI's construction worker misclassification unit opened in 2021, of the 28 investigations the department opened that year, the agency had closed only 10 cases as of August 2023. So in other words, about 2/3 of the investigations they started in 2021 were still open about 2 years later. Currently, there are no standards in law that agencies should conduct investigations involving worker misclassification within a certain time frame, or frankly, even that state agencies must investigate or audit misclassification at all. However, the longer an agency takes to determine whether workers are misclassified, the longer those misclassified workers are potentially being harmed, as well as law-abiding employers. As I mentioned earlier, we recommended that if the legislature would like state agencies to take sort of a more direct approach to addressing misclassification, then the legislature should outline those specific agency duties to do so in law. If the legislature takes that step, we recommend that it also consider amending the law to establish some timeliness standards for these investigations. We also found that agency efforts to address worker misclassification had a limited impact both on the employers and workers involved in misclassification. With regard to employers, we found that when state agencies found misclassified workers, employers faced limited consequences for misclassifying their workers. This is partly because state law establishes relatively few penalties specifically for misclassifying workers, as you can see on page 34 of our report. The lack of consequences for misclassifying for misclassifying employers was also the result of a lack of interagency coordination I mentioned earlier. A misclassifying employer could conceivably be violating multiple laws, including fair labor standards and laws pertaining to unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, and taxes. But because agencies do not coordinate their enforcement efforts, an employer found violating the law may be penalized by only one agency, the agency that found the misclassification initially. For example, DOR may find misclassified workers as part of their audits and penalize the employer for not following tax withholding laws. But because agencies don't generally share information about their misclassification findings, DOLI indeed might not penalize that employer for any of the laws that were violated under those agencies' jurisdictions. With regard to workers, we found that workers may be compensated for only a fraction, if any, of the benefits that they were denied as a result of being misclassified. The extent to which a worker receives restitution for misclassification depends heavily on which agency identified the misclassification. Generally, DOLI is the only agency that focuses on obtaining restitution for misclassified workers. In addition, state law only permits certain workers to pursue civil action to directly rectify their misclassification in court. Specifically, by law, only construction workers can try to directly address being misclassified. Determining the proper penalties for employers that misclassified workers is challenging for a few different reasons. For one, it can be difficult to determine what is sort of an adequate type or size of penalty that would be an adequate deterrent. Also, determining proper worker classification can be genuinely a pretty complicated task, and some employers may very honestly be mistakenly misclassifying their employers. But nevertheless, we do recommend that the legislature amend state law to ensure that employers that misclassify workers on a repeat basis are subject to mandatory penalties, regardless of whether or not that employer meant or intended to misclassify their workers. Even though this can be a complicated topic, we think it's reasonable to expect employers to properly classify their workers after one violation. On the worker side, as we did in our 2007 report, we recommend that the legislature amend law to ensure that all workers can pursue a civil action if they believe they were misclassified. We found in our data analysis that misclassification occurs across many different industries, and given how long it often takes agencies to complete their investigations involving misclassification, we think it's important that all workers have the right to seek a remedy in court if they believe they've been misclassified. For the sake of time today, I won't dive into the rest of our findings, but given the interest we've heard, I do want to highlight two additional topics that we discuss in greater detail in the report, as well as the recommendations for the legislature in these areas. In Chapter 4, we discuss in greater detail the state's efforts to address misclassification in the construction industry specifically. And in Chapter 5, we discuss worker classification and the gig economy, including in our appendix where we have a few different policy options that other states have pursued with regard to classification and gig workers. You can find a full list of our recommendations at the end of our report. And with that, Chair, I'll conclude my formal remarks, and I'm happy to stand for questions or step aside for agencies, whatever you prefer.
Thank you. Senator Rest.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the explanation of the rest of the report answered my question.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to the the audit you did and the stuff you brought up is good. And the agencies are going to come up and speaking. It'd be nice if we offline received reference to national and federal classifications so we understand the variability. There may be federal level, across the different states, and especially our neighboring states, because that adds to the confusion maybe of some of the employers and some of the companies that work across state lines. But if they're out of the recommendation, we could get a better understanding of how the agencies could communicate to each other, so that if they're doing an investigation and they're checking and, well, this is flagged by us, but all agencies should have the same checklist that they use. The priority is what's underneath them, but they should be aware. And then if they see something they think is, it's not their purview, but there could be of concern, they should notify both the other agency and the employer to give them a heads up. Because I think communication and education of the employers is a big component. So the interaction of the different agencies, notification, and we could even in statute put, if notification is given to the employer of a possible issue, that within 1 week, 2 weeks, a certain period of time, they need to investigate and address, so that if later on they're found to have not appropriately followed, that any suit or action by the employee could then go back to that date. So it would simplify the court confusion, because there's notification and there was a reasonable amount of time for them to take care of it. And then they're responsible for, if they're found guilty of violation, of some sort of monetary compensation to the employees. And that way we have a logical process set up for everyone, and we don't have the courts confused. Make it easy for the courts to understand, because I don't think this area has been made straightforward, consistent, and easy for anyone to totally understand, and that has problems. So some of this is for the agencies that are going to be speaking, and thank you. And I think it seems like you did a good job. So I would never say that you were badgering them in this audit. And forgive the pun, but it was too tempting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Quam, thank you for your comments. I appreciate that. I think we certainly saw the lack of sort of communication and coordination as a real challenge, one of the bigger ones, and frankly, one that we had highlighted in 2007 as well. I think the points you raise are good in terms of thinking through how agencies might better communicate, collaborate with each other on this topic. We do give some examples in our report, really starting on page 38 primarily, that talk about some other states' approaches. For example, and I apologize, I can't remember which state it was off the top of my head, but there's one state where they've even put together sort of a centralized data system that the different agencies can tap into. And so then instead of relying on manual communication or things like that, everybody sort of has each other's findings at their fingertips and are able to use that in order to sort of manage and address misclassification across all the different agencies. So I think there are a number of different ways, various task forces, things like that, that other states have sought to sort of improve that communication. And I think that's a great comment. And as well, thinking through, as you were saying, sort of communication with the parties that might be involved in these cases. I know we heard from state agencies there are some challenges in terms of communicating with parties given what's permitted in the Data Practices Act. But that's something as well, certainly, that agencies could discuss and bring to the legislature. The legislature could consider changes as well to facilitate better communication, both with outside parties and amongst the agencies.
Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my statement or comments were around that same coordination, and it looks like they really, they just don't have to. They're not empowered by law or any other reason. But I think the real key will be interesting. I thought there might have been a little collusion between the OLA and the bill that we're hearing today in state government that covers a lot of the recommendations. And so I appreciate Dolly's response from an agency perspective, because it appears, one, they read your entire response and responded comprehensively. And a lot of those issues appear to be at least a framework to address most of your findings and recommendations. I think that's great. I think the education piece is clear, right? Everybody's got to work together, although it adds complexity because it adds the AG and Department of Commerce into the mix, but they're all important and they play an important role. But I think everybody hopefully takes away that in this case, if an investigation is opened, remember we have one taxpayer who believes they're doing business with the state of Minnesota. And so when these investigations are driven by these multiple employment-driven agencies or administrative agencies, they still only see one state of Minnesota. And so when resolution and investigation should open, I think one can assume that's a comprehensive review. And as I think you highlighted, your testimony, it could be one agency today, 2 years later, another one, and haphazardly find out that, you know, they have right of cause of action for another agency. But we also know too, between those agencies, they also drive the definition of employee, contractor, or the classifications. Revenue is more driven by the IRS, and Dolly and others are not. And so the consistency is going to be necessary. And so I hope we'll be looking at, when we do this, it should drive all the agencies, be required, not shall. I think it says shall. It should be may for the agencies in here. It shall be, they must communicate and build the system to be able to facilitate and hopefully coordinate the efforts, right? And coordinate the resources to more efficiently resolve these cases. And then when resolution occurs, it shall be a resolution indicating and highlighting all of the violations across each state agency, hopefully, before anything can be concluded, right? I think if there's short-term notification, right, we're working out, but you know, they're aware of there's an investigation, but I think it should be very clear that it is one state of Minnesota and the agencies, they haven't had to work together, mostly because they don't have to. The law doesn't enable it, but if in this case, I think the recommendations of the framework are coming, but I hope we go make sure that it is required that the agencies work together once an investigation is, whether it be a clearinghouse for account tracking or whatever that is, and then coordinate the resources. Because right today, we've got 3 agencies replicating the same audit, looking at the same procedures and policies, pretty similar guidelines to achieve the same results. And we see one that takes 2 years to do it. I just have one question. In our communication, you indicated for deed that the newest available data to work from was in 2018. And so that implies to me that, is it really true that deed hasn't done an audit since 2018?
Project Manager
For
Badger.
worker misclassification, sorry.
Project Manager.
Chair Hansen and Senator Cran, thanks for the question. I will give sort of a high-level answer to that, and then I know DEED staff are here and they can certainly speak to that as well. Our understanding from DEED staff is that without getting into a lot of complexity, DEED conducts certain random audits, which are the ones that we included in our evaluation, and that during the COVID pandemic, they stopped primarily conducting those audits, at least certainly at the same sort of scale as they were conducting them before. And so given the timing of when they sort of received data from employers and all of that, it did mean that the most recent data that they had that was comprehensive for the random audits was 2018. I'm sure that they can speak to additional details about sort of that process and why that happened, but that is our understanding from conversations with those staff.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Cran.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. And so was there a reason given why that work hasn't been completed in a more timely manner, or that you didn't have any data, really comprehensive data to work with from 2018 till now?
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Senator Cran, our understanding was there was some challenges in that DEED had primarily up to COVID been doing their audits in the field, if you will, not fully, but that it didn't necessitate going out into the field to do some of their work, and that COVID sort of upended that existing process. And so there was some sort of fallout from that. Again, I'm sure DEED could provide some additional sort of details about exactly what happened there. I know they were in communication with the federal government about some of these challenges, but I might punt it to Deputy Commissioner Rowe to give some additional details about exactly how the agency handled that situation.
Thank you.
And Senator Cran, I just want to clarify, so when you made a comment about collusion, that was in jest, it was not.
Oh.
Oh,
What is
Mr.
that?
Chair, absolutely. The time and I looked at it and then I looked at the foundation and that was the results or the bill was the result of a task force that was created around this very issue. And so the alignment was amazing and the timing was even more amazing. So thank you.
And Mr.
Auditor Munson Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just do want to say that we are always delighted when we come in and ask questions. And that is an impetus for agencies to start looking at their own processes and thinking about how they can better them even before we end up making those recommendations. So, thank you.
I have three people on the list and we do want to hear from the agencies. So Representative Jacob, then Representative Greenman, then Representative Lee. Representative Jacob.
Well, thank you, Chair Hansen. So when an investigation occurs, who's initiating the investigation? Is it ever the employee or the employer? Is it always the government?
Representative Hansen and Representative Jacob. Great question. It does vary somewhat, and I'll say it also varies by agency. Certainly all of the Dolly, Deed, and DOR do accept complaints. So an investigation or an audit could be facilitated as a result of a complaint that they receive from a worker or other sort of outside stakeholder groups. Dolly is also implementing sort of a more strategic compliance approach. So in addition to possibly responding to complaints, they've recently adopted this approach where it's more sort of on the initiative of the agency to conduct an investigation. Deed and DOR, they're regularly doing audits just as part of their normal day-to-day activities. So Deed, for example, needs to audit by federal requirements a certain share of employers paying into the unemployment insurance program. So their audits are generally more sort of as a result of business practices and needing to fulfill other state or federal requirements. So they may respond to complaints, but I'd say a lot of their activities are more coming out of these just sort of annual processes, audits that are expected of those agencies.
Yeah, follow-up question then. It's probably fair to assume that many times the employer and the employee are probably willingly misclassifying for both of their benefits. So is that then the government has the authority to come in and direct those classifications as the government sees they should be? I'm thinking largely the government's incentive is to not have people be independent contractors because the government has less control over their tax returns that way.
Mhm. Chair Hansen and Representative Jacobs. I would say a couple of things on that point. The way that the state collects data or the lack of data on this topic, it would be difficult to say whether or not what share of employers or employees are sort of willfully wanting to be misclassified. I think to your question about whether or not the government is trying to sort of dictate that state law, I mentioned those classification tests. So whether or not somebody should be classified as an employee or an independent contractor, that's really dictated by state law. So it's not up to the agencies to decide how they want to classify somebody for their purposes in state law. And you can see that on our report on page, let me see, 24 and 25. State law outlines a number of different factors that it requires state agencies to consider when making these determinations. So it's not up to what the employer wants or the employee worker wants, and it's also not up to what state agencies want. That's all been outlined for at least for workers' compensation and for unemployment insurance in state law. And the IRS, the Department of Revenue follows IRS standards on that.
It's
Representative Jacob.
one last question. And I mean, there has to be just a complete spectrum from the independent contractor's perspective of whether they would be a employee or whether they would be a independent contractor. You know, if the carpenter has his own tools doing work specifically for a certain company for an extended period of time, I'm sure that could be classified either way. And whose authority then is it? Is it does the authority fall to the independent contractor if that's how they want to be classified? Because there's got to be some gray area from one end of the spectrum to the other.
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Jacob, I think your comment about there being gray area is a good one, and that's actually something we discuss in the report. This is sort of a complicated landscape, and determining a worker's classification can be tough. If you look at those various tests that we have on page 24, 25, there are a lot of different factors people are supposed to be weighing, and the tests are not always the most objective. You know, people could sort of read in one direction depending on how they weigh various factors. And so it could be possible that one person, given how they weigh the various factors in law, could say, you know, I think this person's an independent contractor. Somebody else might say that same person is an employee. And so it is a complicated legal landscape in terms of trying to make these classification decisions, something we didn't really have time to talk about here today. But to that point, given the number of tests and the complications there, we do actually recommend streamlining the number of tests that are in law to try and sort of make it a little bit easier for folks to determine whether or not somebody is an employer versus an employee. That's a a recommendation we also had in our 2007 report, because it can be complicated. It can be a bit of a gray area. And we think trying to streamline some of that would make it a little bit easier for people to make a proper classification decision.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your work. I think at the beginning of this audit commission, I said your 2007 OLA audit report was why I wanted to be in this commission. So I really appreciate the work and how it really does lead us to do good work. And I think to your point, Senator Crane, I think a lot of these issues have been around since the 2017 or the 2007 OLA report. So now we're just, I think, taking a crack at addressing them again. I have a few questions about, you talked about the impact it has on workers, and they talked about the impact it has on employers. I'm sort of interested in that, but I'm also really interested in the impact it's having as policymakers around the table on government. So when we talk about, you know, when you misclassify a worker, you're not paying taxes, you're not paying into the UI trust fund, you're not potentially paying workers' comp, which may not affect us directly, but may in the uncompensated care, or may affect the workers' comp rates of employers who are following the law. And then I think the reason I also think it matters is we're about to roll out paid family medical leave. And so you wouldn't be paying into that either. And I think as policymakers, one of the questions that I have is how much is this impacting the UI trust fund? How much is it impacting our tax revenue increase? Do you have a sense of that?
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Greenman, it's a great question, and certainly something I think we were interested as well as others. I think part of the challenge in determining, though, the true government impact is just the overall lack of data that's out there right now on the rate of misclassification. Until we get a little bit better handle on that rate, it's going to be tough to figure out really on a project or a program by program basis exactly what impacts there are on tax revenues, what impacts there are on unemployment insurance program, things like that, until we can get a little bit more generalizable rate in order to make those calculations. It's tough to say one way or the other, but I think your comments about all those various different programs that could be affected by this is certainly true.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that. I think getting a handle on that is really important because like the misclassification rate, you know, and I think that the gig economy sort of piece at the end, construction, we've been. Oh, sorry, I have not had my microphone on the whole time. Construction is something we've been talking about for a long time. But as we think about, I don't think the gig economy was around in 2007. And so it just adds a level of complexity, but also thinking about the government loss. One of the other questions I have in terms of thinking about how this affects folks is, and we think about the penalties is, you know, the report talks about how most agencies, I think outside of DLI, really don't have a penalty. Like maybe you pay back what you owed. I'm thinking about when we think about ultimately our goal, which should be deterring this, the cost benefit to a business matters. And so when we think about what a business making a decision, right, of what they're gonna do and how they're gonna do things. I'm wondering if, and I have sort of two questions related to this, but like, did you calculate how much a business could save by not paying UI taxes, on their, or taxes, UI, workers' comp, wage and hour, earn, save, and sick, and now pay family medical leave? And to that extent, do the penalties we have actually, at this point, make sort of at least even the playing field? Or is it just a good business decision? Now, like, I don't ever think violating the law is, but there's not criminal penalties here, right? We're just talking about economic penalties. So I'm wondering if you looked at that at all.
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Greenman. I think to your question about penalties, and we talk about this some in the report, it can be tough to figure out sort of a penalty rate or a type of penalty that can be an adequate deterrent for a business. I think in talking with agency staff, for example, the Department of Revenue has a 2 or 3% tax that they levy as a penalty if they find somebody misclassified a worker. When we spoke with those staff, they said for some businesses, that penalty is a huge hit. It's very much a deterrent for them. It's a lot of money. They said for some other businesses, though, that's just a drop in the bucket. It's really just the cost of doing business. So I think there's some challenges in terms of making those sort of assumptions about sort of how painful, I guess, if you will, a penalty might be for one employer versus another. We do talk in the report. We made the recommendation that at minimum, the legislature ensure that law, or ensure that agencies are able to penalize worker or employers for misclassifying their workers repeatedly. We do lay out some other possible penalties that the legislature could consider, or sort of changes to law that would alter agency sort of enforcement authority. We lay that out as consideration for the legislature. I think, again, the challenge in making these determinations is really figuring out on a business by business basis, which is going to be sort of an adequate deterrent in order for people to not just consider this to be the cost of doing business.
Representative Greenman and then Representative Lee.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, because I think I have heard over and over again while working on this, that at this point it's the cost of doing business, and it's actually when you're talking about the cost benefit. And even if, we're never going to be able to enforce our way out of this problem just because of how big it is, right? We are not going to have thousands of investigators at all of these agencies. And so again, it feels like from the best government response, we really need to be thinking about and maybe understand more what actually from small, medium-sized business, but what they're actually saving by violating the law. And then make sure, and I think when we think about the penalties piece, there's a public defender. We always thought about, like, there's really two things. There's sort of the certainty of getting caught or getting punished, and then there's the sort of the pain of it, that, like, how big is it? And right now, I think we have you're almost most likely not, given the amount of resources that we're putting into enforcement, right? We have 2 folks at DLI. Probably a few folks sort of around, but also the penalties are, if the penalties are paying back what you already should have paid plus a little bit, those don't seem like effective deterrents. And so I think that when we think about, whether it's requiring intentionality to be proven, which is really hard, or frankly, like the repeat offender, unless we think we're gonna have the resources to continue investigating the same people, then the punishment piece isn't, unless we can make sure it's certain. And so I think that we got to think about, I think we're going to think about how much benefits are actually, business are actually saving, and try to quantify that. And then also think about how do we actually right-size punishments so that they're more certain if you get caught, and that they might be more of a deterrent, have an impact so people make the right choice. So I appreciate your work.
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative, I'll just add one little comment too on terms of thinking through penalties. We did hear from some folks too that non-monetary penalties can also be very beneficial or very much sort of a deterrent. And so I think certainly thinking through monetary penalties, that's one direction the legislature and agencies could think through. I think thinking through other sort of perhaps reputational penalties or things like that was something we also heard from stakeholders that can be a real deterrent. You know, if you sort of get a bad name in your industry, maybe that's harming your business. You know, I think we heard from some folks that sometimes those types of things are equally, if not more, sort of a deterrent to businesses. So I think certainly there's a wide array of options to consider on the penalty side of things.
Appreciate that.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just kind of going back to the coordination of the three agencies. So I'm just curious, you have identified that, you know, state law generally allows for the three agencies to coordinate and whatnot. And so I'm just curious, did you ask them why they aren't coordinating?
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Lee, that's a great question. I think partly a couple pieces to that. One is just partly because this is so sort of siloed in terms of the activities that agencies are doing. It's really often when they're looking at issues of misclassification, they're doing that as a result of other agency activities, not as a result of addressing the misclassification specifically. And so I think just sort of by the nature of that, you know, the unemployment insurance program, that's Deed's wheelhouse, right? You know, it's not Dolly's wheelhouse. And so I think it sort of has just happened to sort of be like that. I will note though, certainly we heard from agencies that one of the challenges to them collaborating more is this sort of multitude of classification tests that we talk about in the report. The tests are similar, but not identical. And so I think from at least a couple of the agencies' perspectives, they're like, well, we could coordinate, but we have to do our own entire, in their opinions, they believe they have to do their own entire investigation using their criteria and law and build their case from the ground up, as opposed to sort of working and using information from other agencies. And so I think that's a product of having these different classification tests for different programs. And again, gets back to sort of why we recommend streamlining, if possible, those multitude of classification tests to make it a little bit easier for agencies to more effectively coordinate their efforts.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe this is the last follow-up. I think, you know, I am concerned, you know, when you go down to the next paragraph on page 30, when you talk about if individual wanted to get a remedy, they will have to individually contact three different agencies. And so just to your response from the previous questions, can an agency, even though, you know, if they don't want to go through and do the whole investigation, can't they just give that tip to, you know, if it's something within DOR, can Dolly just give that tip to DOR or the other agencies, vice versa, so that it's not on the onus of the taxpayer, the resident of the state of Minnesota, but, you know, our public agencies, you know, coordinating, or even if not coordinating, informing each other about a potential violation?
Project Manager Badger.
Chair Hansen and Representative Lee, I think that's exactly what we're hoping to see moving forward. That's not what's happening right now. Generally, if an agency gets a tip or a complaint, that stays within that agency and isn't shared more broadly. But I think what you're talking about is exactly what we're hoping to see as part of this broader agency collaboration, coordination, communication, is that something like that would happen, and that it wouldn't necessarily rely on a worker or a stakeholder to go and know that they need to go to every single agency in order to file a complaint if they want to have their concerns sort of holistically addressed.
Thank you. To facilitate, thank you for the report, facilitate timeliness, I'd like each of the agencies to come to the table together. So Department of Labor and Industry, Nicole Bissenbach, Commissioner, Department of Employment and Economic Development, Evan Rowe, Deputy Commissioner, Workforce Services and Transformation, and Department of Revenue, Sarah Bronson, Assistant Commissioner. Welcome to the commission. And I believe Commissioner Blissenbach will go first. Is that correct? Welcome, and state your name for the record.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Nicole Blissenbach, and I am the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. Thank you for the opportunity to provide remarks in response to the Office of Legislative Auditor's Worker Misclassification Report. I want to begin by offering my thanks to the Legislative Auditor and her team on their detailed work in completing this evaluation. I appreciated the professionalism of the OLA staff as they completed their work and their thoughtful efforts in delivering this report. Misclassification fraud has a significant impact on employees, law-abiding employers, taxpayers, and social safety net programs.
Currently, as you've heard, the law addresses misclassification in a piecemeal approach and does not set government up to successfully address this problem or prevent the problem from growing. I appreciate that the OLA report brings much needed attention to the scope of this issue and the current law's deficiencies that hinder attempts to successfully address misclassification fraud. It's important to provide some additional context regarding DLI's enforcement efforts related to misclassification. The report notes many of the challenges we encounter in this area, including highly complex investigations, lack of responsiveness by subjects of investigations, retaliation against workers, limited penalty authority, and more. DLI penalties for misclassification generally require demonstrating knowledge or intent, or that an employer has engaged in repeat violations. Repeat violations are particularly challenging as employers are often able to simply shift their work to separate business entity when they are found to be in violation of the law. In addition to investigation challenges, penalties for misclassification in the construction industry requires the use of a separate statutory and administrative process from the process related to other labor standards violations like minimum wage and overtime. These challenges are amplified in the construction industry, where current industry practice of engaging in multiple layers of individuals to supply labor often leaves construction workers themselves unaware of who they are working for on a project. We take misclassification very seriously and are concerned that the problem is growing. DLI has taken recent steps to address this internally, including making organizational changes to facilitate improved investigation and enforcement, and working with legislators on House File 4444 and Senate File 4483, which respond to the challenges DLI has encountered in enforcing misclassification statutes. Many of the recommendations in the OLA report are addressed in this legislation, including the interagency coordination and cooperation by establishing a partnership. Generally, DLI agrees with the recommendations in the OLA report with some exceptions and qualifications. DLI does not believe that the legislature directing agencies to be more effective in enforcement of misclassification statutes alone will accomplish much. DLI believes that the legislature needs to strive for more active and effective enforcement through many of the changes that we have proposed. DLI's full response to the report and findings are included at the end of the report. I encourage the legislature to take this report seriously and take the appropriate steps to provide clarity in the law, streamline enforcement authority, strengthen enforcement tools and penalties, and provide the disincentives for lack of cooperation with investigations. The proposals outlined in the legislation are direct responses to the challenges we've experienced, and passage of that bill will assist DLI in its efforts to improve its investigative and enforcement work. Thank you for the opportunity to provide remarks in response to the report, and I look forward to continuing working on this issue.
Thank you, Chair Hansen. I'll be very brief in my remarks. First, I would just like to thank on behalf of the agency, the team at the Office of the Legislative Auditor for their hard work on this report. It is a complex subject matter, and we appreciated the professionalism and engagement of that team throughout. I think I won't repeat what Commissioner Blissenbach said in her remarks, but I'll just say briefly from DEED's standpoint, worker misclassification is an issue that impacts ensuring that we have a level playing field for both employers and employees. And we take it very seriously at the agency. And we appreciate the recommendations that have come out of this report. I did want to just address Senator Curran's question from earlier, if that's all right. The objective, I think one of the objectives of this report was to attempt to get a representative sample of the data to essentially try to get to a rate of misclassification based on DEED's methodology. 2018 was the last year we had complete data before a pandemic year for that. If they tried to base the analysis off of 2020, 2021, 2022, it would have been choppy due to pandemic related impacts and kind of the changes that resulted from there. I do want to assure you, of course, that now that we're back to normal operations in that regard, the audits and those kinds of data are available as we go forward. And happy to answer any questions on that naturally. But the goal there was to try to get to some level of statistical representation, although methodologies have naturally changed between 2007 and 2018. But again, I'll just conclude my remarks and happy to take any questions, just to state our appreciation for the efforts in the report and our eagerness to be a partner to continue to address this issue.
Commissioner Brownson, Department of Revenue. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. I would also like to thank you for allowing us to come here and provide remarks following this report. The Department of Revenue would like to thank the Office of the Legislative Auditor for the review of this subject. We agree with everyone else. It was a professional and thorough review of the statutes and the processes that the agencies use to enforce worker misclassification. We appreciate their identification of the challenges and the impacts employee misclassification has to our state, as highlighted in their evaluation. And we agree with the value of coordinating the work to effectively administer worker classification laws. Revenue agrees that this discussion is critical for achieving a fair and equitable revenue system. And the perspective and insight brought forward by this report will inform our work at Revenue as we continue to look for ways to improve and refine our processes. So I just want to thank you again for having us here to give remarks. I am happy to take any questions, and we look forward to the continued discussion and work around this topic.
Senator Cran, quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Deputy Commissioner Rowe. On the 2018 or the availability data, just looking for, and I know you guys get guidance through this COVID piece that you didn't have to do certain things from a federal level. All I care is that if you suspended your activities, that no taxpayer was harmed because of your suspension of activities from a penalty or whatever the consequences would be. That's all I was looking for.
Commissioner Rowe.
Chair Hansen, Senator Coran, that's correct. Obviously, naturally, if there was, as activities had to change during the pandemic, there was a naturally an understanding that things had changed. So appreciate that.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all of you, thank you for your response, and especially DL. I really appreciate that. And so to the extent that right now, the Representative Greenman's bill is still moving forward, what are you doing currently to coordinate? I would imagine there are complaints coming in right now that you are receiving until we get something done legislatively. And so are you coordinating right now currently?
Who wants to take that one? Or each of you?
Uh,
Coordinate.
Chair Hansen, Representative, we've been coordinating specifically related to the partnership entity that is presented in the bill. And we're continuing the conversations about how to make the relationships easier with regard to data sharing, how we can address some of the issues that come up there with regard to being able to talk to each other about every aspect of open investigations. But we do think that the process put forward in that bill of establishing a partnership, assigning specific duties, requiring the partnership to meet to and help determine what can make us more effective in that partnership. And coming back to the legislature to share that will help us be more effective moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you're communicating, you've got your checklists and your procedures. It'd be nice if you had everybody's was included together, but the top would be yours, that you do the more detailed, but you keep an eye open and you verify the rest. And as to the data privacy and this and that, all your organizations have strict controls on data privacy. So whether you've got the data information or one of your partners has it, you're still having the same strict control. So therefore, sharing data and information between your agencies doesn't show a lack of control or protection of data and privacy. because you're all doing the same wonderful job, right? And therefore, I don't see there being any excuse for the agencies not sharing between each other because you're both, or all three, doing an excellent, complete job of protecting that data, and there is no risk of loss of that protection. So I look forward to the more cooperative effort amongst your group. Thank you.
Commissioner?
Chair Hansen, Representative, I think the answer to that comment is that there can always be better streamlined ability for us to share data. We have the ability sometimes. We don't have the ability when it relates to other pieces of data. I know revenue, for instance, has very specific rules that the IRS imposes on the data they collect. Deed from the U.S. Department of Labor on the information they collect for the UI system. So I think there is great opportunity for us to be able to streamline that data sharing in the law and make it very clear and take away some of the risk that we see that exists currently.
Representative Greenman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I really appreciate this conversation, and I actually have a question for not you, Commissioner. Because I think that one of the things that was helpful in this report, and I think there's the two agencies that are not here, are probably the Department of Commerce, their Commerce Fraud Division as it relates to workers' comp, and then the Department of Human Rights. So this is sort of a question for them too, even though they're not at the table, in terms of discrimination laws that only apply to employees. But one of the things I'm wondering, because at sort of being on Labor Committee, we've talked a lot about the penalties and pieces in that attached with DLI, with the statutes under their jurisdiction. I actually wasn't aware and sort of didn't really know, and still I'm sort of getting up to speed in when about the penalties that attach when someone violates as it relates to unemployment insurance, as it relates to tax revenue. And I think, again, when we talk about both the question, I think it raises of intentionality, like requiring to prove intentionality. But I would like to hear more from you all, not today, but about what we need to do to strengthen those rules so that we are not just focusing on the misclassification of 0.722, but also saying when somebody when someone is found as, and whether it's a cross referral or not, to not have paid their taxes because of unemployment insurance or because of workers' misclassification when they haven't paid into the trust fund, or in the future when they don't pay into paid family medical leave. So I really encourage this. I don't think that that's part of your response, but I think that that's going to be really important when we talk about a whole of government approach, that each of the agencies that's enforcing actually has penalties that deter. And so that sort of my charge is, I think we need to do more work there.
Sounds like a great follow-up in committees of jurisdiction. A couple things just looking ahead. Thank you again for your responsiveness. On the 20th, we're going to be having the evaluation subcommittee narrowing down the topics. The next program evaluation will likely be released while we are on break to get that out. And that it will be available for the committees of jurisdiction to hear that presentation. So that's my understanding of kind of the next few weeks ahead. Look forward to seeing everybody when we get some of these tasks completed. This meeting is adjourned.
Nice work. Salad. Salad and animal. Thanks.
We were short on time, so.